Alright guys, welcome back to our Civil War Notes, Part 3. Make sure you have your Google Doc opened to the Civil War Notes, Part 3, and follow along. Remember, all of the things that we need to fill in are going to be in yellow on the PowerPoint. Also remember, if you miss something, if I go too fast through it, just pause your video or go back and watch the section that you missed. All right, so let's talk about black troops. So African American soldiers never fought for the South, but their slave labor was used by Southern soldiers. So the North also used African American labor, but that changed after the Emancipation Proclamation when President Lincoln issued the proclamation to free the slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the non-occupied states, which meant it freed none of them. But it also meant that blacks joined the Northern Army and fought against the South. So the South refused to return any black prisoners or their contraband. So the black troops fought in segregated units led by white officers. They were paid less than white soldiers, and they died in greater numbers, not because they were assigned to a dangerous job, but by working in close proximity to one another, they caught diseases more often. So they were more likely to be killed when captured rather than taken as a prisoner or even themselves being considered as contraband. They were just more likely to be killed because the South saw them as traitors. So, Fort Pillow. There were over 200 African American and some white soldiers who were killed after they surrendered to the Southern troops. So Nathan Bedford Forrest led the slaughter. And just to tell you the kind of person that he was, after the war, he and some others that he knew formed the Ku Klux Klan, which were the ones who completely fought against racial integration and fought against rights for African Americans. Slave resistance. As Northern troops neared plantations, the slaves gained strength and they broke tools, they joined the troops, and they neglected their livestock. Okay, so this was what they could do. They couldn't do a ton. They didn't have weapons, but this is what they could do to support support the North, and show the South that they wanted their freedom. So the war affects the economy. The South began to run out of men, food, and supplies soon after the war began. They printed so much currency that it had little value. Even today, people still have like Confederate dollars that their great great grandpas had or something like that, and they are almost worthless just because the South printed so many. So the Northern blockade, remember, as part of the Anaconda Plan, it effectively stopped Southern trade with Europe. And so that brought the South's economy to a standstill. So the Northern economy. The North suffered, but not nearly as bad as the South. Inflation was worse in the North, like 80% by the end of the war. Industries that supplied the military, however, boomed. So machinery took the place of workers drafted into the GAR, or the Grand Army of the Republic. Women in the workplace. So women took on many of the jobs and duties of men who left to fight. They were paid less. One of many ways business owners made tremendous profits during the war. So Northerners paid the first income tax to pay for the war. And the soldiers suffer. So soldiers' rations included hardtack, beans, bacon fat, and, if they were lucky, a few bones from which they could suck the marrow, or the inside part of the bones. They often had ticks, lice, dysentery, and diarrhea on a regular basis due to poor hygiene. Medical care. A doctor's kit looked more like it would have been used for home renovations. Body wounds were often ignored. If somebody had a serious wound, the doctors knew that there was very little they could do to save that person's life, and so the person was left to die. A good surgeon could remove a limb, so if it was a wound that was only to your legs or arms, then a good surgeon could remove your limb in 1 minute. So they usually used ether. Sometimes they would use alcohol to sedate the patient. So once soldiers received care, the worst was to come. So having the limb removed was not actually the worst part of this. But not knowing about germs and bacteria, doctors and nurses regularly examined wounds without washing between patients. So gangrene and other infections passed from man to man. Also, they usually did surgery outdoors. So think about all of like the bugs and the pollen and the dirt that would get into open wounds when people were performing surgery. Okay, so lots of people died because of this. In fact, for every soldier that died on the battlefield, 2 died in the wartime hospitals. Now, women served the military as nurses. We've already talked about Clara Barton. She was the founder of the American Red Cross. But then also Sally Tompkins was well known for helping improve medical care at this time. Prisoners. So until the Union began using black soldiers, both sides regularly exchanged soldiers rather than keeping them in camps. Okay? If you think about it, how someone would have to treat a soldier, they would have to have a place for them to stay, food for them to eat, supplies for them to use. They would have to keep an eye on them to make sure they weren't sick. And they had to do that for their prisoners as well. So when the Confederacy refused to swap black soldiers, the North stopped the exchange program because neither side was equipped to keep these thousands of prisoners. So they set up what were called prison camps. So both sides treated their captives terribly. So Fort Delaware and Elmira prisons in the north and Libby and Andersonville prisons in the south saw mortality rates over 25%. So there are things like poor nutrition, poor hygiene that led to scurvy, dysentery, and other fatal diseases. So here's an example of Andersonville prison that was in Georgia. So this was one of the South's prisons. So Henry Wers was placed in charge of the camp at Andersonville. This place was built to handle 10,000 people, and it eventually had over 33,000 prisoners. Their only water was a stream that ran through where horses grazed, so it was filled with manure. There were no buildings to house prisoners, only tents and lean-tos. The guards, some as young as 12, surrounded the camp on watchtowers, and anyone who got near the fence or the dead zone was shot immediately. Although the camp was operational for less than 1 year, over 12,000 people died in that prison camp. Survivors were transferred from the camp to other camps in the South after it closed. The commandant, Henry Wers, was tried for war crimes in 1865 because what he let happen at that prison was so horrible. So the North, whenever they put him on trial, they really wanted him to provide information about General Lee and President Davis, but he did not. So Wers was hanged. Sorry, that should be hanged, not hung. He was hanged in Washington, D.C. after his death and was treated as a martyr, or like a victim who died for his cause. All right, so that wraps up our part 3 notes. So again, we'll meet back here for part 4, our last section of the Civil War notes.